Hello and welcome to this lab demonstration on vSphere vMotion migrations. After completing this lab video, you will be able to migrate a running virtual machine from one ESXi host to another ESXi host. When you migrate a live virtual machine while it is running, we refer to this process as vMotion. In contrast, if the virtual machine that you migrate is powered off or suspended, we call it a cold migration. What you have to consider when talking about vMotion is that there are three types. You can change only the compute resource, you can change only the storage, or you can change both. In this lab, we will migrate a live virtual machine by changing its compute resource from one ESXi host to another ESXi host. vMotion is an amazing feature and you will find it very useful in lots of scenarios. After adding new ESXi hosts, when you have to shut down an ESXi host, for example for hardware maintenance, and it is a mandatory component of a vSphere DRS solution. Note that for vMotion to work, all involved ESXi hosts must have access to a shared data store, and they must be connected to a vMotion-enabled port group. And of course, you want a migrated virtual machine to maintain its network connections. Therefore, you have to make sure that the port group of the virtual machine exists on both ESXi hosts and that on both ESXi hosts you have the necessary uplinks to the physical network. Note that there are additional requirements for so-called cross vCenter migrations. This applies to migrating VMs across vCenter server instances, but we are not going to do that in this lab. What should you already know for this lab? You should know the vSphere client user interface and you should be familiar with ESXi host networking configuration elements, such as vSwitches, port groups, and VM kernel ports. In the first task of this lab exercise, we will configure vSphere vMotion networking on one ESXi host, SA-ESXi01. In the next task, we will do the same on another ESXi host, SA-ESXi02. Then we will prepare virtual machines for vSphere vMotion migration. We will power on two virtual machines, and on one of them we want to verify that there are no interruptions to the virtual machine during migration. So we will run continuous pings on that virtual machine and check if we see any timeouts when we vMotion the virtual machine to another ESXi host. In the last task, we will actually migrate the virtual machines from ESXi host SA-ESXi01 to SA-ESXi02. And on the virtual machine where we started the continuous pings, we will watch the responses to those pings while the virtual machine is migrated. I'm sure I provided you enough good reasons to watch the following video on vSphere vMotion migrations. Now let's get started. In the first task, we will configure vSphere vMotion networking on ESXi host SA-ESXi01. This ESXi host is managed by vCenter server SA-VCSA01, so the first step is to connect to this server. Then we log in as administrator at vSphere.local. In the navigation pane, we have to go to Hosts and Clusters. And in the ICM data center, in the folder Lab Servers, we find our two ESXi hosts, SA-ESXi01 and SA-ESXi02. We select the first of these two ESXi hosts, and then in the right pane, we select the Configure tab, and under Networking, we select Virtual Switches. We see that there is one vSwitch at the moment, vSwitch 0, and down here we see another vSwitch, vSwitch 1. Let's have a look at this one. vSwitch 1 has a port group production, and then we have some virtual machines within this port group. But we want to add a completely new vSwitch for the vMotion network. So we click Add Networking. Now we have to select the type of the network that we want to add, and in our case we want to add a VM kernel network adapter used for vSphere vMotion. So we keep that adapter selected and we click Next. On the next page of the wizard, we have to select the target device, the vSwitch, and we want to create a new switch. So we select New Standard Switch and we click Next. Now we want to add a physical adapter. So we click the green plus sign. And in this case, we want to use physical port vMNIC2. So we select this adapter and we click OK. We can now review the configuration. So we added the switch with one active adapter, which is vMNIC2. So we click Next. Now we are going to add the port group to that vSwitch. In our case, the name of the port group should be vMotion. Now we have to enable the service vMotion, because that's what we want to use the port group for. So this VM kernel port will be used for vMotion. We click Next. Now we have to assign the IP address to the VM kernel port. We want to use a static address of 172.20.12.51. The subnet mask is 255.255.255.0. We keep the other settings at their default values and we click Next. Now we can review the configuration and then we click Finish. So when we scroll down in the list of virtual switches, we can now find a new switch, vSwitch2. Let me expand it and scroll down again. Actually, we're here. So we see that we have a physical adapter, vMNIC2, that's our uplink to the physical network. We have that port group called vMotion, and we have a VM kernel port with the IP address 172.20.12.51. And when I click the dots here, we can see more details. Let's click Edit Settings. And you see under the available services that vMotion is enabled. So this is a port group used for vMotion. In the next task, we want to do the same on ESXi host SA-ESXi02. So we click this host in the navigator pane. In the Configure tab, in Networking, under Virtual Switches, we click Add Networking. We want to add a VM kernel network adapter on a new vSwitch. We add a physical adapter, vMNIC2, to that port group. We click Next to move on. Now we have to configure the VM kernel port. The name should be vMotion. And that's also the service that we want to enable on this VM kernel port. So we click Next. We have to configure the IPv4 settings. This time the IP address is 172.20.12.52. And again, it's a 24-bit subnet mask. We can review the configuration, and when we're happy, we click Finish. Again, let's have a look at this vSwitch. So we expand vSwitch2. We have a physical adapter, vMNIC2. We have the vMotion port group. In that port group, we have a VM kernel port. We see the IP address. And when we view the settings, we can see that vMotion is an enabled service on this kernel port. In the next task of this lab, we want to prepare virtual machines for vSphere vMotion migration, and we want to migrate virtual machines Win10.02 and Win10.04. So let's start by having a look at these two VMs. In the navigator pane, we go to VMs and templates. We expand the ICM data center, and in the folder lab VMs, we can find these two virtual machines, Win10.02 and Win10.04. I select VM Win10.02. I go to the Summary tab. The virtual machine is currently running. And we want to have a look at the network interface card of the virtual machine. And under VMware hardware, we can see that network adapter 1 is in the production port group. Now let's have a look at the other VM, Win10.04. And it is in the same port group, production. So both VMs are running. And what we want to do now is we want to start a continuous ping on VM Win10.02 so that we can later, when we actually migrate the virtual machines, verify whether or not we see timeouts on these pings, whether there is an interruption. So let me go back to virtual machine Win10.02 and launch a web console. We're automatically logged in. Now I open a command prompt window. Let's have a look at the IP configuration of this virtual machine. We see the IP address and we also see the default gateway of this virtual machine. Let's start a continuous ping. So a ping that runs forever. To our default gateway 172.20.11.10. We see the replies coming in. Everything is prepared for our vMotion migration. And that brings us to the last task of this lab, the actual migration of these two virtual machines. I leave my web console open, but I'm going back to the browser tab of my vCenter server, to my vSphere client. And we now want to migrate the VM Win10.02 from our host SA-ESXi01 to ESXi host SA-ESXi02. So in the navigator pane, I right-click the virtual machine and then I select Migrate. In the wizard, I have to decide which migration type I want to use. And in our case, we only want to change the compute resource. We don't want to change storage. So we leave the default and we click Next. Now we have to select the ESXi host where we want to migrate to. And in our case, we want to migrate the VM to ESXi host SA-ESXi02. The vSphere client performs a compatibility check. So we would get errors or warnings down here if there would be any problems that are foreseen. But in this case, the compatibility check succeeded. What could be the problems? Well, for example, if there is no vMotion enabled network between the two ESXi hosts. Or since we do not vMotion, so we click Next. Now we have to select the port group that we want to use. You see the source network is listed here. That was the production port group. And the destination network would be production port group as well. And down here we now see which virtual machines are using the production network, and we see our VM Win10.02 is listed here. It is using network adapter 1 and the port group is production. So we click Next. Now we can decide whether we want to run our schedule vMotion with high priority, which is the recommendation, or schedule normal vMotion. The difference is the amount of CPU cycles that are assigned to the actual migration process. And typically you want to use the recommended version to run vMotion with high priority so that the migration can be done as quick as possible. We click Next. Now we can review our settings and then we click Finish to start the actual migration. We can see in the recent tasks down here that the virtual machine is being relocated. And while it's going on, let me have a look to the console and we see that the pings are still working, still flowing. There is no interruption to the virtual machine so far. Back in the vSphere window, we can see that the relocation of the virtual machine is in progress. So we can flip between these two windows now. You can see I can move the window so the virtual machine is fully operational. The pings work, and from the console I can use the virtual machine. I can click icons, I can move windows around. Everything is working. Let me go back. And now we are waiting for that migration to complete. And now we can see that the task completed. So under recent tasks, we see the status completed. And when you look at the summary here, we can see that the host now says SA-ESXi02. Let's go back to the console window. And in the window, we can see that the ping is still running. There were no interruptions in the ping. We can, of course, move windows around. So the virtual machine had no interruptions. Everything was working in a smooth way. So we don't need that command window anymore. And we can also close the console session. Now let's do the same for the second virtual machine, Win10.04. I right-click the virtual machine. I select Migrate. We want to change the compute resource only, so we keep the default and we click Next. Now we select the destination ESXi host, SA-ESXi02. We click Next. We have to select the source network production and the destination network production, and we see that the virtual machine that is affected by this change is Win10.04. We click Next. We schedule the vMotion migration with high priority. Then we click Next and Finish. So we see a new task, relocate virtual machine Win10.04. Let's highlight the virtual machine that is currently migrated. So I click Win10.04 in the navigation pane, and we see that the host is SA-ESXi01. And once the task completed, this should change to SA-ESXi02, just like we have seen it for the first VM Win10.02. And we can see the task completed. And the host changed to SA-ESXi02. Here in the Summary tab of the VM, we could also go to Hosts and Clusters. And when we now look at our host SA-ESXi02, we see these two virtual machines listed under this host. Before we did the migration, they were listed under SA-ESXi01, but now after the migration, they are of course shown under their new ESXi host where we vMotioned them to, which is SA-ESXi02. Congratulations! You have completed the vSphere vMotion Migrations Lab demonstration video. In this lab, we first configured vSphere vMotion networking on ESXi host SA-ESXi01. This included the configuration of a new virtual switch with a new port group and a VM kernel port, for which we had to enable vMotion. And we added a physical adapter to the vSwitch. Then we did the same steps on ESXi host SA-ESXi02, so that these two ESXi servers were interconnected via a dedicated physical network that is used for the vMotion migrations. In the next task, we prepared two virtual machines for the live migration. We made sure that they are powered on, and on one of them we started continuous pings. In the last task, we performed the actual vMotion migration, and we verified that there are no interruptions during this process by watching the pings on the virtual machine. This lab showed you how to move live virtual machines from one ESXi host to another while the virtual machines are running. This is a very common task after adding an ESXi host or before taking an ESXi host into maintenance mode. Note that in this lab we only changed computational resources. The data store of the migrated virtual machines did not change, so we didn't use storage vMotion. Thank you for watching this lab demonstration video. I hope the knowledge acquired here will help you with your daily job assignments, and good luck as you continue your journey in VMware world.